Namaskar. Well, friends, I heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar. This audio visual podcast series has 54 short speeches unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of the multifaceted genius that Dr. Ambedkar was. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had shown for our country. That is what this podcast series is all about. So let's move on. Well, friends, in this episode 32, let us continue what we started yesterday to unravel Dr. Ambedkar's role as a contemporary historian. Friends, do you know that the first book on Pakistan and on the partition of India was written by none other than Dr. Baba Saheb Ambedkar, and that too way back in 1940. This is what I'm going to talk about in this episode. The title of this book was Pakistan or Partition of India. Let's begin, as usual, with the political backdrop. On March 26, 1940, the Muslim League, at its annual session at Lahore, passed a resolution demanding the creation of an independent state, that is Pakistan, comprising the northwestern and eastern parts of India, where Muslims would be in a majority. Dr. Ambedkar was probably the very first one to come to terms with the implications of the Lahore Declaration. By the end of the year 1940, Dr. Ambedkar came up, that is, within 9 months, can you believe that? Within 9 months, he came up with a full-fledged treatise called Pakistan or the Partition of India. When the Muslim League passed the resolution at its Lahore session, making out a case for Pakistan, the whole country was shaken by a storm. In the midst of that turmoil, Dr. Ambedkar wrote this masterpiece on the subject, the first edition of which was released on December 28, 1940. This is a big book, and I'm going to summarize this book quoting Dr. Ambedkar himself in parts. This is how Dr. Ambedkar has summarized this great treatise. India is a single geographical unit. Within this geographical unit and covering the whole of it, there has been a cultural unity from time immemorial. This cultural unity has defied political and racial divisions. At any rate, for the last 150 years, all institutions, cultural, political, economic, legal, and administrative, they have been working on a single uniform spring of action. In any discussion on Pakistan, the fact cannot be lost sight of, namely that the starting point, if not the governing factor, is the fundamental unity of India. Why destroy its unity now? Simply because some Muslims are dissatisfied? Dr. Ambedkar goes on asking questions. Must there be a Pakistan because there is a communal antagonism between the Hindus and the Muslims? The question, however, is the antagonism such that there is no will to live together in a country and under one constitution? Surely that will to live together was not absent until 1937. The history of India from 1920 up to 1935 has been one long tale of communal conflict in which the loss of life and loss of property had reached almost a shameful limit. Never was the communal situation so acute as it was between this period of 15 years preceding the passing of the Government of India Act of 1935. And yet, this long tale of antagonism did not prevent the Hindus and the Muslims from agreeing to live in a single country and under a single constitution. Why make so much of the communal antagonism now? That's the second question that Dr. Ambedkar raises. Dr. Ambedkar goes on and asks us further questions. Must there be a Pakistan because the Muslims are a nation? If the Muslims want to be different nation, is it not because they have been, but because they want to be? There is much in the Muslims which, if they wish, can roll them into a nation. But isn't there enough that is common to both Hindus and Muslims, which, if developed, is capable of molding them into one people? If the emphasis is laid on things that are common, there need not be two nations in India. But if the emphasis is laid on the differences, it will no doubt give rise to two nations. If the Muslims insist on separation, the cynic may well conclude that there is so much that is common between the Hindus and the Muslims that the Muslim leaders are afraid that unless there is partition, whatever little distinctive Islamic culture is left with the Muslims will eventually vanish by continued social contact with the Hindus, with the result that in the end, instead of two nations, they will grow up in India as one nation. If the Muslim nationalism is so thin, then the motive for partition is artificial and the case for Pakistan loses its very basis. Must there be Pakistan because otherwise Swaraj will be a Hindu Raj? The Muslims are so easily carried away by this cry that it is necessary to expose the fallacies underlying it. If the Hindu Raj does become a fact, it will no doubt be the greatest calamity for this country. No matter what the Hindus say, Hinduism is a menace to liberty, equality, and fraternity. On that account, it is incompatible with democracy. Hindu Raj must be prevented at any cost. But is Pakistan the true remedy against it? Dr. Ambedkar goes on to ask further questions. What makes communal Raj possible is a marked disproportion in the relative strength of the various communities living in a country. How have the French, the English, and the Italians succeeded in preventing the Raj of the majority community being established in their country? Surely not by partition. What is their method? Their method is to adopt, their method is to put a ban on communal parties in politics. Dr. Ambedkar asks, have the Muslims thought of this method of avoiding Hindu Raj? Hindu Mahasabha and Hindu Raj are the inescapable enemies which the Muslims have brought upon themselves by having a Muslim league. It is action and counteraction. One gives rise to the other. No partition, but the abolishing the Muslim League and formation of a mixed parties of Hindus and Muslims is the only effective way of burying the ghost of Hindu Raj. There are many lower orders in the Hindu society whose economic, political, and social needs are the same as those of majority of the Muslims, and they would be far more ready to take up a common cause with the Muslims for achieving common ends than they would with the high caste Hindus who have denied and deprived them of ordinary human rights for centuries. To pursue such a course cannot be called an adventure. Herein lay the most fruitful method of achieving communal harmony among Hindus and Muslims and of destroying the danger of a Hindu Raj. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to say, in 1937, Mr. Jinnah made his entry into Muslim politics. And strangely enough, he regenerated the Muslim League, which was dying and decaying. By some early resolutions, Mr. Jinnah showed that he was for a common front between the Muslims and other non-Muslim minorities. Unfortunately, the Catholicity and the statesmanship that underlies these resolutions did not last long. In 1939, Mr. Jinnah took a somersault and outlined the dangerous and disastrous policy of isolation of the Muslims by passing that notorious resolution in favor of Pakistan. One need not quarrel over the question whether the Muslims are a nation or a community, but one finds it extremely difficult to understand how the mere fact that Muslims are a nation makes political isolation a safe and sound policy. Muslims do not realize what disservice Mr. Jinnah has done to them by this policy. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to say, and I quote him again, will Pakistan obviate the establishment of Hindu Raj in provinces where Muslims are in minority? Obviously, it cannot. Take an all India view. Can Pakistan prevent the establishment of Hindu Raj at the center over Muslim minorities that will remain Hindustan? It is plain that it cannot. What good is Pakistan then? It is worse than useless to Muslims where they are in a minority, because Pakistan or no Pakistan, they will have to face a Hindu Raj. Can politics be more futile than the politics of Muslim League? Pakistan, as a remedy against Hindu Raj, is worse than useless. What is my position regarding the issue of Pakistan in the light of objections which I have set out? I have no doubts as to my position. I hold firmly that, subject to certain conditions, if the Muslims are bent on having a Pakistan, then it must be conceded to them. I know my critics will at once accuse me of inconsistency and will demand reasons for so extraordinary a conclusion. Extraordinary because of the view expressed by me that the Muslim case for Pakistan has nothing in it which can be said to carry the compelling force which the decree of inexorable fate may have said to have. I withdraw nothing from what I have said as to the weaknesses in the Muslim case for Pakistan. Yet, I hold that if the Muslims must have Pakistan, there is no escape from conceding it to them. As to the reasons which have led me to that conclusion, I shall not hesitate to say that the strength or weakness of the logic of Pakistan is not one of them. In my judgment, there are two governing factors which must determine the issue. First is the defense of India, and the second is the sentiment of the Muslims. He takes the first one first. Dr. Ambedkar says, the army is the ultimate sanction which sustains government in the exercise of its authority inside the country when it is challenged by a rebellious or recalcitrant element. Suppose the government of the day enunciates a policy which is vehemently opposed by a section of Muslims. Suppose that the government of the day is required to use the army to enforce its policy. Can the government of the day depend on the Muslims in the army to obey their orders and shoot down the Muslim rebels? This again depends upon to what extent the Muslims in the army have caught the infection of the two-nation theory. If they have caught it, India cannot have a safe and secure government. Turning to the second governing factor, Dr. Ambedkar says that the Hindus do not seem to attach any value to sentiment as a force in politics. The Hindus seem to rely upon two grounds to win against the Muslims. The first is that even if the Hindus and Muslims are two nations, they can live under one state. The other is that the Muslim case for Pakistan is founded on a strong sentiment rather than upon a clear argument. I do not know how long the Hindus are going to fool themselves with such arguments. Dr. Ambedkar says it is true that the first argument is not without precedent. At the same time, it does not call for much intelligence to see that its value is extremely limited. The two nations and one state is a pretty plea. But instead of being uttered as a sermon, if it is intended to issue as an ordinance for Muslims to obey it, it will be a mad project to which no sane man can agree. It will, I am sure, defeat the very purpose of Swaraj. The second argument is equally silly, that the Muslim case for Pakistan is founded on sentiment is far from being a matter of weakness. It is really its strong point. It is a matter of sentiment. A constitution, like clothes, must suit as well as please. If the constitution does not please, then however perfect it may be, it will not work. To have a constitution which runs contour to the strong sentiments of a determined section of society is to court disaster, if not invite rebellion. Dr. Ambedkar goes on to say, suppose that new constitution for a united India contained in its all the provisions necessary to safeguard the interest of the Muslims. But suppose that the Muslims said, thank you so much for the safeguards, we don't want to be ruled by you. And suppose they boycott the legislatures, refuse to obey laws, oppose the payment of taxes, what will happen then? Are the Hindus prepared to extract obedience from Muslims by the use of Hindu bayonets? Is Swaraj to be an opportunity to serve the people, or it is to be an opportunity for Hindus to conquer the Muslims and for the Muslims to conquer the Hindus? Swaraj must be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. This is the basic reason for Swaraj and the only justification for Swaraj. If Swaraj is to usher in an era in which the Hindus and Muslims are engaged in scheming against each other, the one planning to conquer its rival, why should we have Swaraj? And why should the democratic nations allow such Swaraj to come into existence? It will be a snare, it will be a delusion, it will be a perversion. Dr. Ambedkar says further, and I quote him again, the non-Muslims do not seem to be aware they are presented with a situation in which they are forced to choose between various alternatives. Let me state them. In the first place, they have to choose between the freedom of India and the unity of India. If the non-Muslims will insist on the unity of India, they put the quick realization of India's freedom into jeopardy. The second choice relates to the surest method of defending India, whether they can depend upon the Muslims in a free and united India to develop and sustain, along with the non-Muslims, the necessary will to defend the common liberties of both, or whether it is better to partition India and thereby ensure the safety of Muslim India by leaving its defense to the Muslims and of the non-Muslim India by leaving its defense to non-Muslims. As to the first, I prefer freedom of India to the unity of India. On the second issue, I prefer the partitioning of India into Muslim India and non-Muslim India as the surest and safest method of providing the defense for both. It is certainly the safer of the two alternatives. I know it will be contended that my fears about the loyalty of Muslims in the army to a free and united India arising from the infection of the two-nation theory is only imaginary fear. That is no doubt true. That does not militate against the soundness of the choice I have made. I may be wrong, but I certainly can say without any fear of contradiction that, to use the words of Edmund Burke, it is better to be ridiculed for too great a credulity than be ruined by too confident a sense of security. I don't want to leave things to chance. To leave so important an issue as the defense of India to chance is to be guilty of the grossest crime. Nobody will consent to the Muslim demand for Pakistan unless he is forced to do so. At the same time, it would be a folly not to face what is inevitable and face it with courage and common sense. Equally, would it be a folly to lose the part one can retain in the vain attempt of preserving the whole. These are the reasons why I hold that if Muslims will not yield on the issue of Pakistan, then Pakistan must come. So far as I am concerned, the only important question is, are the Muslims determined to have a Pakistan? Or is Pakistan a mere cry? Is it only a passing mood, or does it represent their permanent aspiration? On this, there may be differences of opinion. Once it becomes certain that Muslims want Pakistan, then there can be no doubt that the wise course would be to concede to the principle of it. Well, friends, this monumental book by itself created an intellectual storm. When the second enlarged edition was released on January 1st, 1945, Dr. Ambedkar wrote in the preface about the overwhelming response to the first edition, and I quote, "This book appears to have supplied a real want. I have seen how the thoughts, the ideas, and the arguments contained in it have been pillaged by authors, politicians, and editors and newspapers to support their sides. I am sorry that they did not observe the decency of acknowledging the source, even when they are lifted, not merely the arguments, but also the language of the book. But that is a matter I do not mind. I am glad that the book has been of service to Indians who are faced with such knotty problem of Pakistan. The fact that Mr. Gandhi and Mr. Jinnah in their recent talks cited this book as an authority on the subject, which might be consulted with advantage, bespeaks the worth of this book. The book has displeased Hindus as well as Muslims. That it is disowned by the Hindus and unowned by the Muslims is, to me, the best evidence that it has the vices of neither, and that from the point of view of independence of thought and fearless presentation affects the book is not a party production. Well, friends, let's conclude this session here. But before I leave, I would like to request you, if you like this audiovisual podcast series, Bhim Bhashya, please like it, please share it, please subscribe to it. So long until we meet again. Thank you. Namaskar.